All right, hey everyone. Today I am joined by Thaminda, who was able to go all the way up into top 8 at the calling in Portland on Dash.io, and very specifically, this was after the ban of High Octane. So Thaminda, if you want to introduce yourself, anything that might be relevant for anyone who's watching.
Hey all, I'm Thaminda. Yeah, just Dash.io fan, Seattle local. Marco's been beating me up for years at this point. So, like, I don't know. I think there's some truth to the fact that like any success that I have is due to Marco beating me up on this deck for a solid year.
Oh, you've taught me so many rules though. Like the first time we played at the Uprising pre-release, and I had to learn how the layer step worked with
Right.
all
True.
kinds of stuff. So I guess my first question is, how did you adapt to the High Octane ban? So you have the tournament coming up. You have played Dash.io for a little bit, or for a while actually at this point, and we kind of knew that like something might get banned from the deck depending on what happens at Worlds. You have Worlds unfold, and of course High Octane has to go. So with that little prep time in between the ban and the tournament, how did you approach your deck building?
Definitely. So I think that number one is that I think people overrate how powerful High Octane is when it comes to like the aggressive matchups, right? Like I think like High Octane was always it was always quite good, but especially in like the pre-Cerebellum processor world, like there's so many times you'd play the aggro mashup and you're like, wait, this is a red block 3, and like that's all it really does. And like very often what I would find myself doing, like pre-armory deck was just like siding down at least one copy of High Octane usually, because most of the time you'd rather it'd be like a zero cost boost. That's something we can kind of talk about later. That like I don't know, like a red zero cost boost in this deck is just so premium, especially when it comes to like playing the aggressive matchups. And then I think like generally something about calling metagames that I've kind of noticed that I've noticed kind of happen is that especially when it's not tied to like a major event like a Pro Tour or Worlds, people tend to gravitate towards aggressive decks, right? Like they're kind of a little simpler to play. You get a little bit more time in between rounds to get food, to like rest, to go to the bathroom, whatever. And then generally just having a good proactive plan, right, is like I think a strategy that a lot of people like to bring to these sorts of open events. And when you're expecting a metagame that is very like aggressively slanted, I think that's sort of when Dash.io without High Octane doesn't really lose a whole lot, right? Like I think these are a lot of games where like you weren't looking to resolve them all the time in any way. Most of the time you were blocking with it. Like if you happen to end up with a lot of counters, it was kind of there for you to kind of help you dump your pistol counters. But again, in these aggressive games where you can afford to boost a lot, where you're not worried about like your grenades connecting, I think the value of High Octane was always a lot lower. And so it kind of like I think like number one, when it came to building the deck, it was like, all right, well, there's no High Octane. We can still beat aggro. Let's make sure we can still do that really well. Take advantage of the fact that a lot of these decks can't block super well, and then kind of figure out the rest. Like figure out the plan into the decks that can now like truly like block out and fatigue Dio way easier to the best of my ability.
And so, going to the tournament, what heroes were you hoping to see, and which ones were you hoping to avoid?
I think that like Aurora is like definitely the matchup you want the most with this deck of the kind of like top tier decks, right? I think that like any deck that can't block well, you're like pretty happy to see, because you're kind of as soon as you're in one of those matchups, you feel really good, right? Like you just like your boom grenades are going to connect. You're going to get like an insane amount of value. You don't have to worry worry a ton about being fatigued. And you're kind of just like the deck. You can just let the deck do what it wants to do all the time, and like you're already favored, right? So Aurora is pretty good. I think that like I think Zen is a very interesting matchup in that he has all these defensive tools, right? I think every Zen that I saw at the calling was on like wax on, wax off, plus flick flack and all these other sorts of things. But I think you still have quite a bit of game into Zen, and and I'm happy to get into that more later. Where like there was a lot of things you can do to kind of deny the value of his defensive tools, and really punish him for the fact that he has to play all these 2 blocks still for his decks to function, as well as like all the cheat cards, right? And the cheat cards are really kind of your bailout into Zen, where you can't just not play them. Because he has all these no blocks in deck, you can really punish him. And then finally, Viscera is kind of an interesting matchup in that like I think he was kind of one of the decks that I thought might be the most represented going into the event. And then he's tricky in that like he can kind of play these two styles, right? Where like, he can play a little more defensive with like 6 to 9 like 4 blocks. He plays a lot more 3 block attack actions nowadays than he used to. He's playing fewer 2 block non-attack actions. He has insane armor now, right? He's got like like 2 to 3 block on his chest piece. He's got like 2 block on his head, 3 on his arm, and like 1 on his boots, right? So you're kind of fighting through this huge fridge. And so like Viscera is one of those aggressive matchups where you kind of have to be more afraid of fatigue. But at the same time, they are also like they are still playing a good amount of 2 blocks, right? They're playing all these kind of awkward non-attacks that are still very powerful, like Malefic Incantation. They're playing Galaxia, and so they have it. They have like the 2 block count that's like just high enough where I think you can still try to kill them as well. But that is one of those matchups where I think like when they're on a more defensive plan and they're slower, that's actually where I think Hanabi Blaster kind of really like steps up and kind of becomes very useful. I think yeah, those are the matchups you really want to see. Pretty much anything defensive like Victor, New, Enigma, you're like not thrilled about. I think Enigma is an interesting matchup where I think like my 80 was very not tuned for that matchup because I didn't expect to be like the super represented deck, even though I did think it was very strong. And I think that like with like many more hours and reps in the matchup, I think I could have come up with a much better 80 and a much better plan. I just didn't have the time.
And so that's actually a pretty interesting thing looking at the list. It's the first thing that probably stands out to anyone is Hanabi Blaster. So what drove you to this? Was it just the fact High Octane went and you have more boost density? Was it a consideration for fatigue, like all the above, or is there something else going on there?
Yeah, I think it really is a matter of like damage in deck, right? I think that like with like Mechanologist generally and Dash.io especially, right, has kind of always had so many tools to condense damage into between turns, right? Where you can be like, I'm going to take an off turn, I'm going to set up some board state that lets me effectively carry value from one turn cycle to the next, right? And that's kind of always been your tool for beating defensive decks, especially because you are like Mechanologist is also kind of like is forced into this plan of having to boost, right? They're like to like for your deck to function, you're burning cards in your deck. Like every attack is actually 2 cards from your deck instead of 1. And so like the items were part 1 of your kind of plan to combat this, and the second part of the plan was Symbiosis Shot plus High Octane, right? Because you could basically stack 12 damage that you could cash in on your High Octane turn pretty consistently in a slow matchup. And you just like could know you could do that. You could plan your entire game around like drawing the High Octane at some point and then just going off. Without that, right? Like suddenly you don't have nearly as much ability to kind of stack damage onto one turn. And you're kind of forced into thinking like, all right, like now what do I do? Like how do I get more damage out of like the 60 to like 70, whatever, like however many cards you present, like how can I maximize the damage I can present while still like maintaining the ability to damage stack somewhat, right? Because like you're not gonna like even if you are getting like the max value per card, you're still boosting, you're still burning like so many cards per offensive card you play. Like you're not gonna get there on its own. And Hanabi Blaster kind of offers you this like middle ground where like you're not pushed into boosting as much, which is really interesting to think about, right? And that like, oh well, you have to play 3 boost cards a turn, right? It's like on the surface level, you're like, oh well, you can't set up as much, right? You got to play your 3 boost cards. But really, what it is that like in a world without High Octane, the only way to efficiently use your pistol counter is to basically end your turn with a boost into a pistol counter like every single turn you get a chance, right? And every turn you're not doing that, you're kind of throwing away 2 damage that you're never going to be able to kind of catch back up on. And that's kind of precluded on the notion that you're going to look to play 1 item off the top of your deck like every single turn that you're boosting, right? And so if you're doing that, like you're playing your item off the top, you're drawing an item in your hand like roughly like every turn and a half that you draw your 4 cards. You're going to end up in a huge like surplus of pistol counters that you're never going to be able to cash in if you aren't committing to like boosting with the last thing on your turn and then firing the pistol, right? And so Hanabi Blaster means like number 1, you don't have to boost the last pistol like the last time. The third like the text on Hanabi Blaster just says play your 3rd boost card a turn. It doesn't say actually boost. And so like that's number 1. But like it lets you kind of preserve 1 extra card in deck per like chain of 3 boosts that you do when you're not firing the blaster. And I think number two is that a lot of your really, really powerful items demand your action point, right? And so what I mean by that is, I think honestly, Cerebellum Processor and Spark of Genius, right, in this deck are kind of two things that like so often you want to play them and like or if you have a Cerebellum Processor in play, you're gonna activate it and draw your card to end your turn. And a lot of times into these slow matchups, especially, you want a Spark of Genius for like a Cerebellum Processor or like a Teclo Pounder or a Teclo Core, or like one of these items that doesn't have crank, which means you'll draw your card, you'll have no action point. And when you're on pistol, right, you're kind of in this position where you're very often just kind of forced into playing, instead taking like getting a crank item and playing, continuing your turn out, or again you just kind of commit to sacrificing those 2 points of value, right? Because again, like playing Spark of Genius is kind of like playing an item from hand, in that it does use your action point. When you're on Blaster, you don't have that problem anymore, right? Like suddenly these items that are really efficient, that you would love to play, but the opportunity cost of playing them now, like without high octane, means you're giving up 2 points of damage. You aren't giving up that damage anymore, right? So you can end your turn with you boost, play a Cerebellum Processor, crank it, draw a card to put in your arsenal. Cool. Like you've got your counter on Blaster, you've got the value out of the processor, and you can do it again next turn, right? So that's kind of, I think, where Blaster really kind of shines. Like it's the weapon that lets you abuse Spark of Genius and Cerebellum Processor in the slow matchups like much better than anything else can.
Cool. And so going over the list, is there anything that you want to specifically mention? We can look through the sideboard as well. I guess if you just want to give an overall like comprehensive idea of what the deck wants to do.
Yeah. So I think that like, to be honest, there's like nothing that special about the 80 that I brought. Like if you look at this list versus like lists that people were playing like a year ago, like the only difference is like you're playing Processor because you have it now, and you're playing Fast and Furious because it's just like a very, very powerful zero cost boost. But otherwise, like the deck still works the same way it kind of always has, right? Where you're just looking to take advantage of the fact that Dash.io's hero text is just so powerful, right? Like it basically says you have 5 intellect or 5 intelligence if you can find an item. And then you're really just like, given that like her hero text is so powerful, you kind of have to build the deck around like getting value out of this hero ability, right? Like every turn that you don't find an item, you're losing a ton of value. Every turn you find an item, you're basically drawing a card for free, and like that, and like getting to play it without spending your action point. So I think like that's really what the deck is trying to abuse, right? Like you want to play an item as often as you can off the top of your deck, and you want to play the deck in a way where like you're always looking to try and maximize like the odds of that happening turn cycle after turn cycle.
How did you approach sideboarding for the deck? I see some various cards down here. What was your thought process for including them? Were there certain matchups you were trying to target? I guess just talk to me a little bit about that.
Sure. Yeah. So I think what I was generally looking to do is like play a pretty clean 60 into like the really aggressive matchups, right? So like the Mirror, Aurora, pretty much just the Mirror and Aurora, honestly, are the two matchups you can afford to play 60 cards into, where like they're going to have the non-block density in their deck that they can't actually threaten to fatigue you. You can play a clean 60 and just look to boom grenade them to death, kind of over and over again. And the second part of that plan is Heist, right? Like Heist is, I think, a card that people are always kind of back and forth on. But I think in an aggressive metagame where like you're a deck playing boom grenades, you're gonna be forcing their armor. Getting their armor is really good, and like you're also playing T-Bone to help like pull more pieces of armor throughout the game as well. Once you've kind of gone through a few pieces of armor, Heist with like, I think Heist specifically with Cerebellum Processor and Banish is like one of the most powerful things you can have happen in the game, right? Like where like you play, you have like you force like your opponent blocks like a boom grenade, or maybe you like maybe they just like they throw a card just to block damage efficiently because they're like, oh, I have an extra 3 block I don't need, and then you play Heist like towards the end of your chain. Like that can just like instantly like swing the game when you have a Cerebellum Processor, because now it's like, oh well, like the Heist is like +2 like it's 5, but it's actually +2 because it'll give you a pistol counter, plus it'll give you a card if you have a Cerebellum Processor, right? Because you'll crank it, draw the card, fire your pistol at the very least. Like it's like insanely powerful, right? With the caveat, you got to set it up, right? You got to get a processor and Banish. And I think what's interesting there is that, and I kind of alluded to this earlier, right? That like cerebellum processor is a very powerful card, but when you're playing Symbiosis Shot, like activating the processor usually means giving up the 2 damage on your shot, and it's very very difficult in a world without high octane to kind of catch back up on that 2 damage, right? So processor is much worse in a Symbiosis Shot config. But what is nice about that is you can really look to boost away the first one that you can see, so that your heist is now like this like insanely powerful 2 for 5 go again on hit. And I think heist also kind of lines up really neat in a really neat way with BIOS update, where like BIOS update lets you cheat a second item out per turn, lets you cheat out the Tekla pounders. That's like obviously really good, right? But then like BIOS update has a second kind of hidden synergy with heist, where you can like BIOS update heist for 8. And like a lot of aggro decks are not that happy to block 8, like at some point in the game when they've already given you some armor, and that can kind of be like, I mean, that's just like one of the strongest things that you can do that a lot of people also aren't ready for. I think that like if like I have to be ready to block 8 at some point in the game, like when like if I haven't seen heist, like that's one thing, right? But I think people are not really prepared for Dash.io. People have not really been playing heist a whole lot in Dash.io lists, and so that you just like don't have sort of like the mental practice that like, hey, I need to be ready for this at any point. And then you can just like, I mean, there were at least like two or three of my like aggro matchup games ended effectively that way, where I went BIOS update into heist, and like it was like such a huge blowout where like they had to give like two blocks and 2 pieces of armor, or they just had to let it hit because like their hand didn't function without it, and it ended up being like a 2 for 7 draw a card go again, right? Like crazy. So I think that's kind of what you're looking to do into aggressive matchups, and then into any matchup that you think you might get fatigued. I was kind of bringing in at least 68 cards, right? So you're bringing in the max velocities, you're bringing in the underloops, like the extra boom grenades, possibly the penetration script, the pounders, like the extra backup and the extra bios, because you really just need you need cards to boost. The unfortunate reality of mech is that you kind of like you are going to be burning your deck. You just need more cards. And then I guess I like max velocity. Like I feel like it doesn't really need any explaining at this point. Like it's kind of been. I mean, it's a 2 for 10. Like what more do you want? Yeah.
So it sounds like that heist was a pretty big overperformer for the day then.
Definitely. I think people. I think especially given the metagame I need to expect, which is again just like a lot of aggressive decks. Like even though they have a lot of armor, I think that like the T-Bone package, I think is a big part of it. And then like when you know decks are playing 2 blocks, heist suddenly becomes like one of the most powerful cards that you can be playing.
Have you thought at all about what cards you would want to change based on the tournament, how that all wrapped up?
Yeah, I think that like Underloop probably could have been. I mean, really, like the 1 for 4 boost slot, once you've kind of gone through like Zipper Hit and Pulse Wave, is like very very underwhelming. Like you really need them because the deck just needs like 0 and 1 cost boost to function. Underloop was kind of just like fine. Mostly, like if I'm being honest, it's kind of one of those things where sometimes you can get a worse player to give you armor on Underloop that doesn't matter, and then like the fact they've given you armor now means like a better, like you can get a boom grenade through instead. That was honestly the reason I played it. It could have been Fender Bender, it could have been Medex, it could have been like the 1 for 4 +1 when you banish an item. Like it doesn't really like they're all kind of like they're very very marginal, different like in different matchups. Like they'll slightly overperform each other in ways that don't really matter a ton. And like over the course of a tournament, it's probably a wash. I think the other thing to consider is that like I thought like I was playing the BIOS update and like Pounder package because I think like it's just kind of it's something that I played with quite a bit in the past. I have a lot of familiarity with it. I understand like the play patterns and how to set it up. But something that I like after the fact I'm going to come to realize is that like they have so much anti-synergy with the Hanabi game plan, and I think that like playing this package really made my Hanabi plan a lot worse, right? Like if the BIOS updates were just 3 more red 0 cost boosts, and I played like 1 pounder instead and like one other, I don't know, blue. I'd have to think about it. You could probably end up with like you just have like more boost cards in deck. You're more likely to be able to boost to get your 3 boosts per turn. You're more like it's easier to fire off max velocity, just everything, right? Like BIOS update and max velocity having anti synergy is unfortunate. BIOS update and Blaster having some anti synergy is also unfortunate. And it's like while I do think that my like 68 to 70 card like Symbiosis Shot plan into decks like Zen, for example, like really benefited from playing BIOS and Pounder. I think I was giving up points in matchups where I was kind of forced into playing Blaster, like Enigma and into defensive Viscera decks.
So, if someone were to take this list and start playing, what do you think would be some common mistakes that that player would make, and basically how to avoid them?
Yeah, I think that like there's a lot of interesting things that come with playing Dash.io in that like on the surface you're like, this is an aggro deck, all my cards are really efficient, I have all these no blocks, I should just be like hitting my opponent in the face over and over again, and like not really worrying about it, right? But I think that like it's pretty important to kind of get out of that mindset quickly and kind of understand like, oh, actually like the most important thing is my hero power, right? I need to be efficiently activating my hero power as many times as I can per game, because like I'm giving up 4 health, I'm playing all these non-blocks in my deck that all kind of suck to draw. Like you draw a Boom Grenade, you're like, wow, this is like so sad. You draw even like Red Backer Protocol, like it's a good card, but like you draw it, it's like so bad. You're like, cool, I will just like I will play this card and pay 2 resources to get like another and to get like a 0 for 4, right? Like it's so bad. And so really what you need to then think about is like, all right, I need to like, number one, be playing as many items off the top of my deck to kind of counter the fact that I'm giving up 4 health over playing like, you know, dash IE. And then number two, I need to have ways, I need to have like the right plan to not get super punished when I draw these non-block items, right? Because every time you draw a non-block item, you're like, well, this is like, you know, things are like it's going to be a hard turn to be efficient, and that's kind of why the number of red items you can play is like really low, right? Like there's the 3 red Boom Grenades, there's the 2 red BIOS, or not the BIOS, the backup protocols, and like that's it for the reds, right? And every other item is a card that can be a pitch card. And actually, I think that's another thing. Like people very often look to just play their items because they're like, cool, it's an item, it's efficient, it's good. But so often, like you should be pitching them. Like that should be your pitch card. And if you have an extra blue boost card, like you should block. You should actually block, right? Like especially, I think something people don't consider is that when you choose to like play a blue boost card, you're like playing you're playing like an underrate damage card and burning your card from your deck, right? And so like you're basically giving up 2 cards in your deck, which really matters. Like your deck that you are going to go to fatigue in a lot of games. Like I mean, I had a game against an Aurora in like my second to last game of Swiss that like went to fatigue. Like the last card in my deck killed him, right? And like it was really important that at some point in the game I didn't boost like a blue throttle. I blocked with it. To both have 3 health to tank damage on the last turn of the game on my opponent's last cycle, and then also have 1 extra card to boost to actually win, right? I think so. Being like a little less afraid to block with your extra blue boost cards, I think, is kind of one thing you're looking to do. And I think the next thing is that like you're very often looking to boost multiple times per turn, but I think the biggest thing is that once you've found your item for the turn, you don't need to boost anymore, right? The caveat being like, you can boost to fire your weapon, right? Like if you're like, I'm on Symbiosis shot, cool. I'll boost like the last time of the turn I want, if I want to, and then I'll like fire my pistol, cool. But I think very often like you'll have found your item for the turn, and now you're like, okay, I can boost one more time, and then I can fire my pistol, or I can just fire my pistol and I can arsenal this boost card, right? And arsenaling the boost card is one of the best things you can do in this deck, right? Because like every time you arsenal like a 0/1 cost boost, especially, you're basically saying I have arsenaled another way to look at the top of my deck, right? I have another way to look for an item. And I think that also kind of like leans into the next part, right? Where it's like boost cards are both ways to dig towards an item and also to dig towards power cards, right? I think like the fundamental powerful part about Dio that people overlook, like beyond just playing items off the top of your deck, is that like with the information of like what you're gonna draw next, you can look for Spark of Genius, right? Like Spark of Genius is like the most insane card in the game. Like it's Codex before Codex happened, except it blocks 3, right? And it's a Mechanologist card. Like it's so powerful, and like the more Spark of Geniuses you resolve in a game, like the better your odds get of winning. And like every single boost card in your deck basically reads like look for Spark of Genius, right? Like get 1 card closer to Spark of Genius, right? And like like Flesh and Blood is a game where like you can commit to blocking and you will see most of your deck. Like you're going to see your power cards. Like, and I think a lot of the kind of defensive Zen decks that have been doing really well recently take advantage of that. Like they're going to see like the chi hands that turn into like these huge like chase lines over and over again. Dash is the same way, except you can do that on offense, right? You can boost away your like bad like yellow and blue boost cards and kind of dig for Spark of Genius. You can dig for like Cerebellum Processor off the top. You can dig for Core off the top, right? These are all like insanely powerful cards when you can play them, or like just draw them, and you can just look for them. And I think that like always considering like, hey, when I'm boosting, like, do I like should I look for like do I is this a game where I'm willing to kind of sacrifice a card in my deck to look for a power card because I need to get ahead on the damage race is like a consideration you can kind of that you need to kind of take advantage of every turn. I think that like the Dash.io players that do that really well, where they're always kind of like, oh, like maybe I'll activate Foundry Heart, right? Even though I don't need the resource, just because like I haven't seen my Spark of Geniuses and like I want to get closer, right? And the card on my top is kind of whatever. And like, sometimes you banish the second card and it's Spark and like it sucks, but the odds of that are really low. We're playing a card game. You got to just like play the percentages, right? I think you should always be looking to play this deck in that way where you're like, oh, like what do I need to do to win? Right? Like do I need to be like speeding up my damage clock? And in which case, like I should be boosting more aggressively. I should be activating Foundry Heart. I need to look for items and power cards, or do I need to slow it? Like I'm ahead enough on the damage race. Like my opponent's not going to kill me before I kill them. I'm just afraid of running out of cards. I need to slow down and kind of like really maximize the value of cards in my deck because I'm not going to die. I just need to like make sure that I get every point that I can.
Were there ever moments where you boosted away an item before you'd activated Dio? Like, are there ever moments where you see an item and it's like not the one you're looking for and you're playing to an out and you just keep on going? Or do you just like always kind of lock in like the first time you have the option to use the hero power?
Yeah, I think that is like that's a really good point, and I think that like is something that separates kind of the better Dio players as well from the people that are kind of just picking up the deck. Is that like a lot of times like the items are good, but they're not, especially when you're not playing Symbiosis Shot, right? Or in a world without high octane where you can't always cash the counters in very efficiently. Like a lot of items are just not good, right? Like to play off the top. Like early in the game when maybe you don't have a 0 to 60 or like a good red boost card that you want. Like a red backer protocol is kind of whatever, right? Like the blue backer protocol is very explicitly whatever in this deck, right? And I think those are like the backer protocol specifically are items that I'm very happy to boost away. And then also, yeah, in an aggressive matchup where I know I have a good odds of getting Heist to come through, I will often look to boost my Cerebellum Processor away. The very first one that I see. Like it really is pretty contextual. Like sometimes you will say like sometimes you'll like Cerebellum Processor is really good off the top, right? Like you play, you crank it, it draws you a card right away, and like explicitly it like when you see Cerebellum Processor off the top, it reads, oh, like my hero ability basically said draw a card for free, like draw a card, go again, right? Like it's like quite insane. But it's like. But it is also very dependent on your hand texture, right? Or and also just like your item density in deck. You're off like something. The better you are at being like, I have this many items left in deck. This is kind of the odds of me seeing an item. Like if I keep boosting this turn, this is the first boost card of the turn, and and especially in a matchup where like you're willing to activate Foundry Heart more often, because like you're less concerned about like of decking yourself. It can like you can kind of boost away your like an early Cerebellum Processor, and just like get a pretty big advantage that way. I think another thing that like you can look to, I think a big thing to consider is that like the second Cerebellum Processor you will almost always boost away because you can never. It's like very very difficult to take advantage of two Cerebellum processors in play without high octane, right? So if you happen to get one, or if you know that like, hey, I'm planning on Spark of Genius thing for a Cerebellum Processor. Like already because you've drawn a Spark of Genius in hand, you're like, that's just the card I want. And like you plan your turn around that, you boost, and you see a Cerebellum on top. All right, cool. Like sure, I'll boost it away, and then I'll Spark for another one, right? Like that's just something that's like very reasonable to do. It is pretty like it isn't something you will always do, right? I think it's like every item decision in this deck is so contextual. I think Spark of Genius especially is one of those cards that is like so interesting to play with because like. The card that you should Spark for is like so situation dependent, and it's like I think that often people in Flesh and Blood like most decks you play in Flesh and Blood like you're you draw up, and your opponent presents their turn, like their attacks, whatever they're doing to you, and you block with kind of full information of what you're going to do on your turn. Whereas Dash.io, like very often the best decision for like to make on those blocks, and then like converse with, and then also the way you should sequence your turn afterwards is like not at all obvious. Based on what happens, right? Like you need to be thinking like, oh, what items do I have left on top of my deck, or like in my deck? Like what might I see? And like thus, what am I going to do with my hand, right? And especially like when your card is like when you have a Spark of Genius, you're like, oh well, if I have a really big boost hand, maybe I like boost and turn this into a boom grenade and kind of like push 4 damage, right? Maybe I want to set up like a max V, so I'm gonna like spark first for a Teklo core and arsenal whatever I draw, because I know I have like a backup protocol that's like sitting in play with a counter that I'll be able to kind of convert a blue into max V or something, right? You're kind of always thinking about what might happen, and I think that like that can kind of create a lot of interesting situations around when you boost stuff. I think the other thing though is like when you're playing an aggressive matchup, and you're boosting a lot, you're activating Foundry Heart a lot, you are going to see a second item for your turn. It's just like going to happen probabilistically within like your first couple turns, and it isn't usually too hard to get that set up.
When it comes to blocking in this deck, because the mech cards, historically have had really good blocking rates, how often did you value block with this deck? Now, obviously there's blocking out of necessity, but when it comes to just like you do the turn cycle math and it's in favor of you blocking with a certain card, but that card could potentially be another boost to look a card deeper in the deck or to put a counter on the blaster. How often did you just block for value?
Definitely quite often. I think that especially the aggressive matchups, like you shouldn't be afraid to block. And I think something else that like is often a good indicator of like when you should be willing to throw a card in front of something is that like when you see an item on the top of your deck during your opponent's turn, right? I think like first of all, I think it's very important to not get baited into doing that, to playing the card on top of your deck during your opponent's turn, unless you have a way to convert those extra tier resources, right? Like I think in Edirisooriya, it can be interesting that he has rune chance, you can block 2 rune chance, play the item, and like cool, you were efficient, right? Like cool, like you turned your blue into 2 life plus an item. That's totally reasonable. But if it's like a boom grenade on top and like you're playing an Aurora, like you need a really really good reason to like play that on her turn. Like almost all the time, the answer is like no, you should not do this. And those kinds of situations, especially when you already have an item on top of your deck that you know you're going to start your turn by just like playing it right off the top to start, like now the value of your boosts is like so much lower, right? Because like the implicit value of every boost card that you play in every turn is digging you towards that item, right? And as soon as like you've already found the item, you're like, now, well, actually, like it's fine, I can block. Like it's like I found my item for the turn. I'm already like going quite above rate and converting like a random blue boost that I don't need to fuel my turn into a block 3. Like that's excellent.
So for the entire tournament, was there anything that stood out to you that felt really notable in terms of like a matchup you encountered or a certain way that you played a game?
Yeah, I think that like specific games that were pretty interesting were like I played Peter's Aurora, my second to last game of the day, and I think like Peter being a strong player, I had a fairly hot start with a couple boom grenades, and quickly realized that like he could not win the damage race, and pivoted into hard fatigue, and started and played it really well. And that he was like on my off turns, he was finding time to arsenal somersault, and like these are like really good defensive tools. And even though he had these hands with like lots of no blocks, because like Aurora plays a bunch of no blocks, right? Like she's playing Channel Lightning Valley, like Discharge, Lightning Press, whatnot, right? Even though he had like a lot of no block density, it did end up being my like very last hand of the game that killed him. I think that was a fun game where like it kind of reminds you that like you can at any game or any point in any game with Dio, your opponent can kind of force you to change game plans completely, right? Where like at the beginning you might be on this like max, like I'm burning cards in my deck to just increase my turn by turn output, right? Like I'm turning my Foundry Heart into I'm sacrificing 2 cards for that resource and to like dig for more items, and like that's like the correct thing to do. And suddenly like a couple turns in, that cannot be the correct thing to do anymore. And kind of recognizing the point like when that's happening, right? When you see your opponents block with their power cards, when you see them block with CNC, I think is like a very interesting kind of like the thing you should always know. Like when any deck that is playing CNC blocks with CNC against like Dash IO, like an aggressive deck with lots of no blocks, that should be sending off warning bells, right? That like I need to like either they have a second scene they're about to play, and I should be ready to just throw my crown in front of that, or like they really are hard committed to blocking me out, and I need to like switch into this like this mode where I'm like kind of maximizing the amount of damage I can present with the cards left in my deck, and also kind of trying to like compress as much damage as I can into these turns, right? Like really do like the on turn, off turn sort of like flesh and blood classic, except that you have all these tools, right? You have your grenades, you have your backup protocols, you have Teklo Pounder, you have Teklo Core, you have your processor. You have so many ways that you can set up damage across multiple turns if you recognize like that's what's happening and like play for that sort of setup.
So anything else that stood out to you from the 2 days?
Yeah, I think that generally people were pretty underprepared for this deck. I think that like again, like people were very used to like what it did, like right before Worlds, after the armor deck came out, and then during Worlds, during the World prep, and like it played a very specific way. And I think that like ironically the way it plays now is much more like the way it used to play, like pre-armory deck, and that Serial and Processor, especially when you're playing Symbiosis Shot, is kind of like it's a good card, but it's not amazing. Like, it's not nearly as like overpowered as it was when you had High Octane. And like the play pattern has changed just enough that like yeah, you're playing an aggressive deck. You're like you're planning to play all these other aggressive matchups, and you're building your deck to kind of like do like just to like output a lot of damage, or like Auroras, or like a lot of Auroras are playing the combo package. Like a lot, like in most of their aggro matchups, like because like Mercy saw so much success in her Worlds run, right, where you're playing you're playing the Gold Crown, you're playing Iron Weave, and you can really punish those sorts of decks that are on that sort of plan. I think that's definitely a big part of it, and even like a lot of the slower matchups I played, right, like I ended up playing like two Victors, one New, one Enigma, and let me see if I played any other kind of like slow matchups over the rounds. Yeah, I think that's it. But even like my game into the New, where like it was like a CYB New, it was the first round of the day. Like in theory, like that matchup should be an auto loss, right? Like I'm playing Dash, or I'm playing this deck that like gets fatigued. They're healing a bunch. They have a ton of block threes. They have like pretty good armor, like not insane armor, but like reasonably good armor. They have so much disruption. Like every single card in their deck basically says like you don't get to do the fun thing that your deck wants to do. And like by stripping cards, like they're making your hero text so much worse because you can't boost to find your items. But just like straight up, I think just like having more experience in the matchup than my opponent and kind of knowing exactly what I needed to do, ended up kind of being just enough to get there, right? And it's like a matchup that kind of can seem doomed in like when you think about like what's happening when you actually play it out. Like really, when you are playing this deck, you're making your opponent make so many tricky blocking decisions around like boom grenades, around like like sequencing your break points in kind of interesting ways. Actually, yeah, something that I do want to talk about regarding the tournament specific matchups were I did end up playing a bunch of Zens. I think it was like 2 or 3 Zens. And I think those were just 2 Zens that were like both kind of on this defensive fatigue plan into me. With like all the I think like 12 D reacts each. Like they were playing Sync, Flick Flack, Wax On, and Wax Off. Yeah, that was like the board, right? And like you think about these are like really, really good tools into a deck that's trying to go wide with a bunch of attacks at that sort of thing, at that sort of power level, right? But some like an interesting pattern that came up was like always like when you're like sequencing your turn, you never want to open with the 0 cost boost, right? Because you don't want to let them play. Is it the Wax On, right? The one that like if you play a 0, it becomes like a 0 for 5 D react.
Yeah. That one triggers off the 0 cost, and then the other half is when you play it after.
Triggers off of. Yeah, exactly, right? Yeah. So you never open your turn with the 0 cost boost, and so you can kind of make it really awkward for them to get their like to get that sequence, right? To play the Wax On and the Wax Off. Or another thing is like you start your turn with like your 5s, right? Your zipper hits, your heists in that matchup, and then once they commit their Flick Flack, right? Then you go like 3, 4, 3, whatever, right? With your kind of smaller boosts. And you kind of make it so you really can devalue the effect of these like really, really powerful defensive tools that they have. And then finally, just like T-Bone, I think is such an all-star in that matchup, where like their armor is so powerful, and like they have most of them are playing the boots to like have one thing to give to T-Bone, but like you're often looking to line up like 2 to 3 T-bones in a turn, because every time you do that, you get like a ton, like such an insane amount of value. Especially if you have like a boom grenade or something that's live, right? When like you boost a red T-bone, you get a piece of armor from them, and they're like, shoot, I have to give you a card for like 2 points of value here, right? Or even 1 point of value if you're like at the point where you're getting their 2-block armor now, right? I think that's like a very important like specific thing in that matchup that I think can really matter quite a lot. And I think T-bone in general, I think, is one of those cards that's like very skill testing on both sides, where like just like the fact that you have in your deck, like your opponent needs to always consider this, like and like whenever your opponent is playing a deck that is like susceptible to having their armor sniped, whenever they give that first armor block to stop a boom grenade, like they have to be ready to get like T-boned a couple times, and just like have that blow them out of the game. Like I think my last my win in round was against an Enigma. Like really the deciding factor was that they thought like I sent a 0 to 60 with a boom grenade out. They thought for a while they didn't have the D react in hand on that specific turn, and like they ended up committing the boots to block it, right? And I immediately went like T-bone, backup protocol, one more T-bone, right? Completely blew them out because they just like lost their entire armor suite like right away, right? I think you kind of need to always be looking to do that with this deck, and like that's sort of the way that you can kind of get an edge in matchups that you really have no business winning.
I guess a question I should have asked way earlier is, when do you actually bring in the Hanabi Blaster? Is it only for fatigue matchups, or was there any matchup where you brought it in where you were playing 60?
No, I think whenever I brought Blaster, and I was always playing like 68 cards, like at the very least, if not more. I think that like Symbiosis Shot still is like so powerful. And I think also the other thing to consider is that like when you're playing Blaster, like a lot of the rate of the items gets so much worse, right? Like the items in general are like not that good. They're only good because you can play them for free off the top of your deck without having to draw them, and because they give you 2 damage on your pistol, assuming you're playing in this like Symbiosis Shot plan where you're willing to kind of like boost pistol on your turn, or boost on pistol twice if you manage to crank, right? And so like when you are on Blaster, actually like Boom Grenade as a card, which is like normally so powerful, is like suddenly very just like fine. I think that like something that like if you were to take this deck and try to like make it better at doing the Hanabi version of its plan, would be to consider like playing items in the deck that still have crank, right? Because the value of a crank item when you're playing Hanabi Blaster is that when you have the crank item on the top of your deck, and you have Cerebellum Processor in hand, or you have it in play from like a previous turn, or you have a Spark of Genius that you're going to turn into a Cerebellum Processor, right? Like that's when these crank items are suddenly insane, because now the crank item lets you draw the card without giving up your action point, right? But like you can't crank a yellow, or like when you crank a Boom Grenade when you're playing Hanabi Blaster, it's like in that kind of matchup you're probably already struggling to get them to hit, and like you still have that much damage in your deck, right? You can't afford to always throw away like 4 points of damage for the red or 3 for the yellow to crank it. Like so often you have to just play it and like hope like maybe it'll get in, but you don't crank it so that your opponent has to respect 1 more turn of damage. I think one item I would have liked to try if I had more time would be like what's it called? Hadron Collider. Like it's kind of a meme. Like I think it's always kind of been like almost good enough, but never quite good enough for Dash.io. But I think in this world now where like you can't play Symbiosis Shot in every matchup and expect to have a chance, it kind of fits the bill of like it's like a crank item, so that you can use it to get the action point to draw off of your Cerebellum Processor, or like to Spark of Genius for Cerebellum Processor to then draw it. Like you have that option. But it still gives you value, right? You crank it and then you still get like 3 points of value. Just for like basically it turns your hero text into like an Ember Blade for the turn, right? Which is pretty good. Like you pay 2 for 3, go again, sure. Like or really it's like 2 for 3, gain an action point, which is even better, right? That's like fairly reasonable, and I think it would have been better than like Yellow Boom Grenade, for example. And in like the Hanabi spec that I was playing, or like maybe like it might have even been better than like the extra, or than like the blue backup protocol that I was playing, just for like crank item density. And then I think like Bios Update and Type Panda are like very good, but I think that like you could consider doing something else, right? Like to kind of get damage, like to get some damage stacking ability. I think that like Catarun Collider can kind of fit that bill a little bit, and then also just more boost cards. I think like a third Max V might like there's like some consideration there. I think that Max V is still like a very awkward card, in that like it'll often win you the game, and sometimes it'll lose you the game when you draw it. And like I've never liked playing more than two, kind of for that reason, where you can often just like you play three so that you can block with one and boost one, but sometimes you just like draw two and like suddenly like whenever you draw two max velocities at the same time, like you're like the game just gets so hard for like a couple cycles. And I think that like I just find it simpler to not have that problem. I think that like Red Throttle is also just like another card that's obviously quite good. Like tier 4/6 go again is solid. It's good numbers. I wish I had room for it in this list, and like maybe that could go in over the BIOS updates. I think if you were more committed to this like Hanabi Blaster plan.
So I guess to wrap up, is there anything that I haven't asked or that we haven't talked about that you feel like is important to understanding the deck?
Take a quick look at my notes. I think we've kind of covered pretty much everything here. Yeah, no, we talked about the different weapons. We talked about like why, like kind of the different items. I think we talked about like arsenal priority. Oh, actually, yeah, there is like one kind of last thing that I think is very worth talking about. Is that like, what do you do when you draw an item, right? Because like that's like always been the weakness of Dash.io, right? You have these insane rate things that you can do when you draw when you play items on the top of your deck, but that means you need to play like some amount of item density, right? Like you're playing like roughly 15 items in your 60, or like 17 to 18 items in your 68 or 70 that you're playing, and you need a plan to deal with like to figure out like what to do with these items that you're going to draw, right? I think it can be tempting to like, oh, I'll just play my boom grenade, whatever, and like end my turn, not crank it, and try next turn, or I'll start my turn with it and force my opponent to block. That's like a reasonable thing to do in some games, right? Like maybe you're in a game state where like you can get the boom grenade through, but it is like a very, very underrated play every time you do that. And very often I'm kind of looking for ways to like avoid that problem, right? I kind of alluded to the first one, which is just like you play fewer red items so you can turn them into your resource cards for the turn. Instead of using your other random yellow and blue boosts as your resource cards, and just block with them instead. Something else that I think that like can sometimes be overlooked is that like Crown of Providence is like incredibly powerful, right? For so many reasons in this deck, right? Like it lets you dodge CNC, which is like obviously great, right? And also Crown of Providence, when you have perfect knowledge of what you're going to draw, is also really, really good, right? You can be like, oh, you know what? I have this Max V hand that's going to convert into a lot of damage, but I don't quite have the resource card. I have like one too many reds, but the card on the top of my deck is a blue. It's like that, and that fixes the problem. Like this might be worth it, right? But I think the last kind of key use of Crown of Providence is that very often you can kind of like, and this happens a lot in aggressive matchups, especially because I think Aurora is not really playing Command and Conquer these days. Viscera is certainly not playing Command and Conquer anymore. And a lot you have like you're less obligated to save Crown of Providence for Command and Conquer. Using Crown of Providence to convert a bad item that you drew on like a previous turn into a good real card is like so strong. Because like if you convert like a red boom grenade in Arsenal, or like a yellow boom grenade in Arsenal, for example, into like a red 0 to like a red 0 to 60 or a red zipper hit, that's like such a powerful thing to do for this deck, because you're like, oh cool, but the Crown of Providence gave me one more look that gave me one more look on its own. It also gave me a boost card, which gave me one more look, right? Like you're increasing your odds of finding these items so much. You're turning the item, and you're basically pretending that you never drew this item in the first place. So like choosing to Arsenal and like a red or yellow item, especially that you don't really want to play and you can't really pitch efficiently, and then like either committing to crowning it right away, or just like if you don't really need your Arsenal, like on the next turn cycle, being like, I'll let it sit there again, right? Like I'll just like keep waiting until I have time to turn this item into a really good card at the top of my deck. I think that is something that like I found myself doing in like most of the games I play, honestly, because like you're playing like roughly 25% items, you're going to draw roughly one item per hand every single time. A lot of times it's the pitch card, but sometimes it's not the pitch card. And so like you're always going to have that opportunity to do that. And I think that like that is one of the kind of things that you can do with this deck that like gets you a ton of percentage points that you don't otherwise realize. I think the general takeaway I want here is that there's like so many little things you can do with this deck because you have so much information, you have so many tools to kind of be creative and like just like squeeze more and more damage, right? More and more like odds of finding these powerful items, more and more odds of just finding your power cards, like Spark of Genius, right? That like really let you push like way more damage than you expect to. I think that like an easy metric to look at is like you can play like you can just play games and you can look at like the value per turn that you get and like that like Talasher calculates for you, right? Like and that can be against a target dummy, but it can also just be against like any games you're playing against randoms or friends. I think especially like playing against friends with this deck is like incredibly valuable because like there's so many possible lines that I guarantee you're not thinking of everything you could be doing on every turn. I think that I played a very far from optimal tournament. Like I made so many mistakes just because I didn't have the creativity to consider all the lines that exist. And I think that things like using the crown in that way, kind of thinking about playing cards at the top of your deck in so many different ways, or like digging for different things, can really just give you the percentage points that I think like make the deck overperform when you play it really well. And I think that like I think since I've shared my lists, I think like I did not play very many games on this list before I brought it to the event. I do not think that the win rate is sitting at like 38% after I posted it publicly. So clearly, it's one of those decks that I think is very, very easy to not play optimally. And I think especially with high Octane ban, like you don't really get a free lunch anymore. You really do have to play, like squeeze every point of damage you can out of every hand that you see for it to do well.
I now have to sneak in an extra question. How did you use the boots?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, like the gear shift is just, it's just one block most of the time, right? Plus the action point, right? It's always the action point, right? Like the boots are insane because it's an action point when you see like a card that you want with Cerebellum Processor. I think that's like the way to think about it, right? Like you're almost always going to commit your boots to a Cerebellum Processor draw at some point in the game, or the floor is like dumping an extra pistol shot in an aggressive matchup. Where you're like, oh, cool. Like I've fallen behind by like one pistol counter of damage, and like I'm just gonna convert 2 cards in my deck into like the action point for 2 damage, or I'm gonna convert 2 cards in my deck into the action point to convert my Cerebellum Processor draw. Right. I think something that you'll often do, something that's also that's like worth considering, right, is that the same way that Foundry Heart lets you see another card on top of your deck. The boots, like Gear Shift also lets you see 2 more cards on top of your deck, right? And when you're playing this aggressive matchup, I think very often actually what you'll do is you drop into a turn where you have a Cerebellum Processor in play with like maybe 1 counter. So you'll start your turn, you're going to lose the counter. It'll be a 0, and you'll have one more chance to draw off of it, right? I will usually before as soon as I can commit I'll activate the boots because I'm like I know I'm going to draw something. So I want the floating action because something with Gear Shift especially, right? Because you have to activate it first before you get the action point. Like you have to boost before you processor. So especially if the card on top is not something I'm really looking for, I'll activate the boots because that's all right. Number one more look for an item, right? Number 2, it lets me dig for a card I actually want to draw off the processor. And I know when you have processor out, you just know you're gonna be able to convert it. I think that's something you should look to do. And again, having processor out and doing that is kind of the same as when you have Spark of Genius, right? If you have a Spark of Genius, you can always kind of commit that this extra action point, I'm going to be able to use it efficiently because I can convert it into I convert it into an extra draw plus an extra pistol shot, or I can play another item off the top and convert that pistol shot counter without having to crank it. If for example it's a Tekla core or something. I think that the boots are just another really, really great tool for kind of doing that. And then I think that you're kind of always going to look to line it up with your processor at least once per game.
Makes sense. Is there anything else on your mind for today? I mean, obviously you're going to continue to refine this list as time goes on, but for today, is there anything else?
No, I think that's pretty much it. I think we talked about a lot of fun things. I think I've always had a lot of thoughts about this deck. I've been playing it for honestly since it came out, way back in early heavy hitters. It's kind of one of the decks I put a lot of games on. One of the decks that you beat me up with your Azalea on quite often. That matchup is still honestly so cursed. I think that like I think like especially in the state, like a strong Azalea player is I think like a very like it's one of those matchups that like you kind of are like you're gonna lose most of the time. There's like nothing you can do. Red in the Ledger is just a hell of a card. But yeah, no, it's been a pleasure.
Yeah, no, thank you for coming on. Thank you for taking the time. And just of course want to give you congrats for making top 8 at the calling, which is already a huge accomplishment in itself, and it's even bigger considering that you did it fresh off the tail end of a ban for the deck. So it's pretty sick. It's like good last minute engineering, thoughtful planning, and of course like good gameplay during the tournament. If anyone wants to reach out to you for like questions or anything like that, where could they find you?
I'm definitely like not super active on social media, but I think that like generally Discord, if you put it somewhere in purple, that's usually the best place. Like I'll see it eventually. Like somebody will tag me, and I'm happy to answer anything. I don't know. I feel like again, Flesh and Blood is a game right now where I think there's like not so many secrets in terms of like gameplay, like deck lists, like everything. I think like things are generally pretty figured out, and also like people are very happy to share because it turns out that like it's so hard to play the game perfectly. Like you could have the perfect 80 cards, but you're just like not going to perform nearly as well as somebody who like really understands like why every card in those 80 is there, and like what each of those cards does in every matchup, right? So I think like there's truly no advantage to be gained by keeping anything secret. Happy to answer any questions.
Yeah, so they can consult the Oracle in Discord.
Yeah, pretty much.
Sweet. All right. Well, once again, thank you for taking the time to chat about the deck. And I guess that's the two of us going to be signing off. So thank you all for watching.
Thanks, everyone.